Imagine waking up one morning to find out your family's home, your sister's cherished property, was sold without her knowledge. Sounds insane. Well, that's exactly what happened. But the HOA made one critical mistake, and they never saw what was coming. The call came early in the morning. I was still half asleep when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. The voice on the other end was frantic. Did Emily sell her house? It took me a second to register what I had just heard. What are you talking about? I muttered, rubbing my eyes. Her house, it's got a sold sign on the lawn. I sat up straight. That couldn't be right. Emily had inherited that house from our parents just a year ago. She had no plans of selling. If anything, she had been talking about finally setting up the garden our mom had always dreamed of. I grabbed my keys and rushed over. The moment I turned the corner onto her street, I saw it. A bright red and white sign, planted right in front of her house. Sold. I slammed the brakes so hard I nearly hit a mailbox. My heart was hammering as I jumped out of the car. Emily was already there, standing on the front porch in her pajamas, staring at the sign with a look of utter disbelief. "What the hell is this?" she whispered. A middle-aged man in a blazer, probably the real estate agent, walked up to us, checking something on his clipboard. "Ah, you must be the previous owner," he said with a rehearsed smile. "I know this must be a bit of a shock, but everything is in order. The new owners will be moving in next week." Emily cut him off. "I didn't sell my house." The man's smile wavered. "Excuse me?" I stepped forward. "You heard her. She never put this house on the market. There has to be some mistake." He frowned, flipping through his papers. No mistake here. This was an HOA-initiated sale. The property was deemed abandoned due to unpaid dues. It went through auction last month. For a moment, the words didn't make sense. Then rage flooded through me like fire. Unpaid dues. I turned to Emily. "Did you?" She shook her head violently. "No. I've paid every single one of those damn fees." I spun back to the agent. "Who authorized this?" The agent sighed, clearly annoyed. "That would be your HOA board. You'll need to take it up with them." Emily was already marching to her car. "Oh, I plan to." We stormed into the HOA office 15 minutes later. The place had an air of quiet arrogance. Cheap corporate decor, a receptionist who barely glanced up, and the faint scent of stale coffee. "We need to speak with someone about my house," Emily snapped. "Do you have an appointment?" the receptionist asked, bored. Emily slammed a stack of papers onto the desk. "I own the house. Or at least, I did until you sold it behind my back. So yeah, I think I have an appointment." That got her attention. She glanced at the papers, then at Emily's furious expression, and picked up the phone. "One moment, please." A few minutes later, we were ushered into a conference room where 3 people sat waiting for us. At the head of the table was Gerald Whitman, the HOA president. A man in his mid-50s, with a thin mustache and the kind of smug expression that made you want to punch him. "Ah, Miss Emerson," he said smoothly. "I was wondering when you'd come by." Emily folded her arms. "Cut the crap. Why is there a sold sign in front of my house?" Gerald sighed, as if we were children who didn't understand basic rules. "Your property was auctioned due to unpaid fees. It's all in accordance with HOA bylaws." "That's bullshit," I snapped. "Emily's up to date on her payments. She's never missed one." Gerald leaned back in his chair, tapping a folder on the table. "According to our records, there was an outstanding balance of $1,200. Emily's face twisted in anger. "That's impossible. I paid that last month." "Did you?" Gerald's smirk widened. "Because we sent multiple notices regarding the overdue amount. When we received no response, we followed standard procedure." I could feel my hands clenching into fists. "You never sent any notices." Gerald shrugged. "Perhaps they were lost in the mail." "Liar," Emily hissed. "You did this on purpose, didn't you? You wanted my house gone." The smirk never left his face. "We simply enforce the rules. If you have an issue, you're welcome to seek legal counsel. But I should warn you, this sale is final. The new owner has already paid, and the deed has been transferred." Emily looked like she was about to explode. I placed a hand on her arm to steady her. "We're not done here," I said coldly. Gerald chuckled. "I believe you are." We walked out of that office, shaking with rage. Emily's fists were clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. "They stole my house," she whispered. I took a deep breath. "Then we steal it back." Emily sat on her now-stolen porch, her hands gripping the arms of the chair so tightly I thought she might snap them off. Her face was pale, her jaw locked in silent fury. The realization had settled in. This wasn't just some clerical mistake. The HOA had planned this. They had stolen her home, and now they expected her to just walk away. I wasn't about to let that happen. We need proof, I said. Something that shows they lied. If we can prove you never owed anything, we can fight this. Emily inhaled sharply, shaking herself out of the shock. I have records. Receipts. Every payment I've ever made to them. We rushed inside, tearing through old files, emails, and bank statements. It didn't take long to find it, an email confirmation from 2 months ago, proving that she had paid off every single cent they were claiming she owed. It was time-stamped, verified, and bulletproof. I held up the printout like it was a winning lottery ticket. They screwed up. They had no legal right to sell your house. A glimmer of hope flashed in her eyes, but then she hesitated. Even if we have this, what can we actually do? They already sold the house. That was the question, wasn't it? Fighting an HOA was like trying to take down a hydra. Cut off one head, and another sprouted in its place. But I wasn't the type to back down from a fight. We take this to war, I said. The first strike. Our first move was to confront the HOA directly, armed with the evidence. We marched back into their office, this time shoving the receipts onto Gerald's desk. You want to explain this? I demanded. Gerald barely glanced at the papers before smirking. I see what you're trying to do here. But unfortunately, the sale is final. The home is no longer in Miss Emerson's name. Emily's fists clenched. You lied. You knew I paid. That means the sale was illegal. Gerald sighed, rubbing his temples as if we were giving him a headache. Look, these things happen. If there was an error, you're free to file a complaint with the state board. A complaint? I barked. You stole her house. That's a very dramatic way of looking at things, Gerald said smoothly. As I said, the new owner has already taken possession. If you'd like, we can discuss a courtesy settlement to help you transition. I had to stop Emily from lunging across the desk. A courtesy settlement? Are you kidding me? Gerald's smirk grew wider. It's the best you're going to get. I leaned in. We'll see about that. Calling in reinforcements. Leaving the office fuming, I knew we had one major weakness. We weren't lawyers. And fighting a corrupt HOA without legal firepower was like bringing a knife to a gunfight. Luckily, I knew someone who could help. My friend Mark was a real estate attorney who had spent the last few years dealing with exactly this kind of HOA fraud. One quick phone call later, and we were sitting in his office, laying out the whole story. Classic HOA scam, he muttered, flipping through the documents. They pull this stunt all the time. Declare a property abandoned, sell it, and pocket the money. 99% of people just roll over and accept it. Well, we're the 1%, I said. What can we do? Mark leaned back. Good news is they screwed up. Badly. They never gave Emily proper legal notice before the sale. That means, in the eyes of the law, the transaction is fraudulent. If we can prove it in court, we can get the sale voided. Emily's eyes widened. Wait, really? Really, Mark said. But we need to act fast. Once the new owner takes physical possession, it gets a lot harder to undo. How much time do we have? I asked. Mark checked his watch. About a week. The smear campaign. 1 week to take down an entire corrupt HOA. That meant we needed more than just legal action. We needed public pressure. Emily and I spent the next 24 hours putting together a media blitz. First, we blasted the story on social media. We posted screenshots of the fraudulent paperwork, the proof of payment, and a summary of how the HOA had stolen the house. The reaction was instantaneous. People flooded the HOA's Facebook page, demanding answers. Others started sharing their own horror stories. Within hours, the HOA was being dragged through the mud. Next, we tipped off local news stations. A reporter showed up at Emily's property the next morning, microphone in hand, asking for an interview. Emily, with fire in her eyes, told the world exactly how her home had been stolen. By the end of the day, it was all over the news. And that's when things really got interesting. The HOA starts to panic. We got a call from Gerald. His usual smug confidence was gone. Listen, he said, his voice strained. This is getting out of hand. Maybe we can find a way to work something out. Emily crossed her arms. Oh, now you want to talk? Let's be reasonable, Gerald continued. You're making a lot of noise, and frankly, it's not a good look for anyone. What if we offer you a settlement? Maybe double the market value of the home. I saw the flicker of hesitation in Emily's eyes. That was a lot of money. But I wasn't about to let Gerald get away with this. Not happening. I said before Emily could speak. We're going to court. And when we win, you're going to be the one writing the check. Silence. Then a sigh. Your funeral, Gerald muttered before hanging up. The war was officially on. That night, I sat across from Emily at her dining table, legal documents spread out in front of us. You think we can really win this? She asked. I grinned. Oh, we're not just going to win. We're going to burn that entire HOA to the ground. Emily took a deep breath and nodded. Let's do it. Next stop, the courtroom. I barely had time to enjoy the small victory of rattling Gerald before the real battle began. The next morning, Emily and I met with Mark at his office. He was already sifting through legal documents, eyes narrowed as he flipped through pages at lightning speed. All right, he said, finally looking up. I have good news, and I have better news. Emily leaned forward, gripping the edge of her chair. Give me the best news first. Mark smirked. The HOA screwed up. Big time. I felt a surge of adrenaline. How bad are we talking? Mark tapped a section of the paperwork with his pen. Legally, an HOA has to provide certified written notice before initiating a foreclosure. That means they have to send you a formal notice via registered mail and get a receipt that proves you received it. Emily frowned. But they never sent me anything. I never signed for any letter. Mark grinned. Exactly. My brain clicked into place. So that means the sale was illegal, Mark confirmed, tossing the papers onto his desk. Without proper notification, the entire process is null and void. We can take this straight to court and immediately freeze the transaction. Emily's hands trembled slightly. Are you sure? I mean, what if they fake something? Mark shook his head. They can't fake a registered mail receipt that's handled by the Postal Service. There's no record of any such notice being delivered to your address. Without that, their case collapses. A slow smile spread across my face. Oh, this is going to be fun. The legal landmine. We wasted no time. Mark filed an emergency motion in court to halt the sale. The judge granted it almost immediately, which meant the so-called new owner was suddenly holding onto a property that legally wasn't his. But here's where things got really interesting. The moment the injunction was issued, the new buyer showed up at Emily's house, furious. He was a tall, heavy-set man in his 50s, wearing a tailored suit that screamed, I have too much money and zero patience. He barely let us open the door before launching into a tirade. You have two choices, he snapped. Either you take the money I paid for this place, or I force you out. Emily raised an eyebrow. You mean force me out of my own house? The one I never sold. The man, who introduced himself as Carl Weston, a real estate investor, wasn't amused. I don't care what legal loopholes you think you've found. I bought this place fair and square. You think you can just undo that? I stepped between him and Emily. Actually, yes. Your little deal with the HOA is falling apart as we speak. They sold you something they had no legal right to sell. You should probably take that up with them. Carl's face turned an impressive shade of red. I don't give a damn what you think you're doing. I've got money and I've got lawyers. This house is mine. Emily crossed her arms. Then why are you standing on my porch? Carl's eye twitched. You're going to regret this. And with that, he stomped off, unraveling the web of lies. After Carl's dramatic exit, we got to work. Mark was already pulling every legal trick in the book, and in the meantime, I decided to do a little digging of my own. Something about this whole thing felt off. I started looking into Carl Weston, and it didn't take long to find something very interesting. Carl wasn't just some random buyer. He was directly connected to the HOA board. Specifically, he was business partners with Gerald Whitman. That was the moment I knew we had them. The HOA hadn't just accidentally sold Emily's house. They planned it, setting the trap. Armed with this information, we called a town hall meeting, open to all homeowners. We wanted every single resident to hear the truth. The room was packed. Dozens of frustrated homeowners filled the seats, all eager to hear why their HOA was suddenly all over the news. Gerald and the rest of the HOA board sat at the front, trying, and failing, to look composed. Emily took the stage first. I'm here today because the HOA illegally stole my home and sold it behind my back. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A few residents murmured to each other, nodding. Emily continued. They claimed I didn't pay my dues. I have proof that I did. They claimed they sent me legal notices. They didn't. And do you know who they sold my house to? Silence. I stepped forward, holding up a folder. Carl Weston, a real estate investor. And, oh, look at this, Gerald Whitman's business partner. The room exploded. Shouts of "Are you kidding me? And they did this to the Johnsons last year," filled the space. Gerald stood up, trying to regain control. "Now, let's not jump to conclusions." I cut him off. "You stole homes from this community and handed them over to your buddy. This wasn't an accident. This was theft." Mark, standing in the back, held up some papers. "And the courts agree. The sale of Emily's house? Officially voided. Which means, Gerald, you and your little friends are about to have a very bad week. The HOA's house of cards comes crashing down." The next morning, things got even worse for Gerald and his goons. A local news station picked up the story and ran it on primetime TV. The headline: HOA president caught in property scam. By noon, the state attorney general announced an official investigation into the HOA. Turns out they had been pulling this stunt for years, illegally seizing homes, selling them to insiders, and pocketing the cash. Gerald, for once, wasn't smirking. Instead, he was lawyering up. As for Carl, he suddenly wasn't so interested in Emily's house anymore, especially after his own assets were frozen pending investigation. But the best part? The HOA's insurance company, the one that backed them legally, announced they were dropping their coverage. Which meant every single lawsuit coming their way, the board members would have to pay out of pocket. Emily sat across from me at her kitchen table, sipping a cup of coffee in her rightfully reclaimed home. She smiled. "Well, that was fun." I grinned back. "And we're just getting started." Next stop? The courtroom. The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the back rows, their cameras flashing as Emily and I walked in with our lawyer, Mark. The air was thick with anticipation. On the other side of the room sat Gerald Whitman and his crumbling HOA empire, flanked by a team of overpaid attorneys desperately trying to salvage a sinking ship. But it was already too late. The moment the judge entered and the case was called, I knew we had them. This wasn't just about Emily's house anymore. This was about systemic fraud, corruption, and the outright theft of properties. And today, they were going to answer for it. Opening fire. Mark stood up first, his voice sharp and commanding. "Your Honor, this case is simple. The HOA, led by Mr. Whitman, unlawfully seized and sold my client's property without her consent. They failed to provide the required legal notifications, they falsified records, and they directly benefited from the fraudulent sale." He gestured toward Emily. "My client did not miss payments. She did not abandon her home. And yet, the HOA used an illegal maneuver to steal it from her. We have evidence that this was not an accident, but part of an ongoing pattern of fraudulent foreclosures." The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes, turned to the defense. "Mr. Whitman, do you wish to respond?" Gerald's lawyer, a slick-looking man in a $1,000 suit, stood up, adjusting his tie. "Your Honor, the HOA acted in accordance with the bylaws set forth by the community. The plaintiff may feel wronged, but the fact remains that the house was sold in a legal foreclosure process." Mark smirked. "Legal, you say?" And then he dropped the bombshell. The smoking gun. Mark walked up to the judge's bench, handing her a thick folder. "Your Honor, here is the official registered mail log from the United States Postal Service. It shows that no notification was ever sent to my client regarding foreclosure proceedings." The judge flipped through the documents, frowning. Mark continued. "Under state law, failure to properly notify the homeowner renders the foreclosure invalid. That alone should end this case." Gerald's lawyer shifted uncomfortably, clearly not expecting us to have concrete proof. But Mark wasn't done. "And in case the defense wants to argue clerical error, let me present Exhibit B." The courtroom screen lit up with an email exchange between Gerald and Carl Weston, the so-called buyer of Emily's home. In it, Gerald wrote, "House is yours. We'll handle the paperwork. Don't worry about Emily, she doesn't know yet. Just send over the payment, and I'll make sure it's vacant by the time you move in." The courtroom erupted. Gasps filled the air as the judge's expression hardened. Gerald turned pale. His lawyer suddenly looked like he wanted to be anywhere but here. Mark turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, this email proves that the foreclosure wasn't just illegal, it was deliberate fraud. Gerald Whitman and his board intentionally targeted my client's home and coordinated an insider sale." Gerald tries to squirm out. Gerald shot to his feet. "That's taken out of context." The judge silenced him with a look. "Sit down, Mr. Whitman." She turned to Mark. "Mr. Benson, do you have further evidence to support your claim?" Mark nodded. "We do, Your Honor. We have multiple former HOA board members prepared to testify that this wasn't an isolated case. The HOA has done this to at least 7 other homeowners, many of whom didn't have the resources to fight back. The judge turned back to Gerald's lawyer. Would the defense like to respond? The man gulped, clearing his throat. Your Honor, given this new evidence, we request a continuance to reassess our position. Mark leaned forward. A continuance won't change the facts. The sale was fraudulent. The HOA broke the law. My client wants her house back today. The judge nodded, then looked at Gerald. Mr. Whitman, do you have anything to say for yourself? Gerald, sweating profusely, opened his mouth, then closed it. The judge sighed. Very well. This court finds that the sale of Miss Emerson's home was unlawful. The foreclosure is hereby nullified. Furthermore, this court will be referring the case to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges. The moment those words left her mouth, Gerald's face collapsed. Emily gripped my hand so tightly I thought she might cut off circulation. I could feel her shaking, but this time it wasn't from fear, it was from victory. Immediate fallout. The courtroom was chaos. Reporters shoved microphones in Gerald's face as he tried to flee. Cameras flashed as his lawyer whispered furiously in his ear. Emily and I stepped outside into the bright afternoon sun free. A few minutes later, Mark joined us, grinning. Well, that went better than expected. Emily laughed, actually laughed for the first time in weeks. That felt amazing. Mark nodded. And it's not over. Gerald and the HOA board are about to be buried in lawsuits. Their insurance company just pulled coverage, and now every single homeowner they scammed is coming after them. I smirked. Karma's a beautiful thing. The sweetest revenge. A week later, Gerald resigned in disgrace. The HOA board collapsed as multiple members were investigated for fraud. Carl Weston? He tried to sue us for his lost investment. The judge laughed him out of court. And the best part? The community voted to dissolve the HOA altogether. No more ridiculous fees. No more corruption. Just neighbors finally free from tyranny. Emily threw a huge party in her reclaimed home, inviting everyone in the neighborhood. As I stood on the front lawn watching people celebrate, she walked up beside me, holding 2 beers. To winning, she said, clinking her bottle against mine. I grinned. And to making sure no one ever tries this crap again. As we sipped our drinks, I noticed something across the street, a for sale sign in front of Gerald's house. I nudged Emily. You thinking what I'm thinking? She smirked. Oh, I love poetic justice. That week, we put in an offer. A few days later, we owned Gerald's house. Now that was a victory. Emily and I stood on the front porch of our newest property, sipping coffee and admiring the view. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on either of us. Just weeks ago, this had been Gerald Whitman's house. Now, it was ours. It all happened so fast. After the courtroom victory, Gerald had been forced to resign in disgrace, but his troubles were far from over. Lawsuits were piling up. The state attorney's office was investigating him for fraud, and his once loyal HOA board members were turning on each other like rats on a sinking ship. Desperate for money, Gerald listed his house for sale. And that's when Emily and I swooped in. With some help from Mark and a bit of legal maneuvering, we managed to buy Gerald's house at auction, for a fraction of its actual value. He had no choice. He needed the money for legal fees, and no one else wanted to touch the house of a disgraced HOA dictator. The day the sale was finalized, we delivered the news to Gerald personally. Gerald's priceless reaction. We pulled up in front of the house just as Gerald was loading the last of his belongings into a moving van. His once pristine suit was replaced by a wrinkled polo, his once smug face sunken with exhaustion. When he saw us, he visibly tensed. What are you doing here? Emily beamed, waving the official deed in front of him. Oh, just checking out our new house. Gerald's jaw dropped. What? He croaked. I clapped a hand on his shoulder. You heard her. We bought the place. Your place. His face turned an impossible shade of red. No, this is harassment. You can't. Emily smirked. Funny. That's exactly how I felt when you stole my house. Gerald's lip trembled. This isn't fair. I leaned in. Oh, Gerald. You of all people should know. HOA rules are rules. For a moment, I thought he might actually faint. Instead, he turned, climbed into his moving van, and peeled out of the driveway like a bat out of hell. Emily and I watched him go, savoring every second of his humiliation. That, she said, was so satisfying. Demolishing the HOA's legacy. With Gerald gone, the rest of the HOA board fell apart. The lawsuits continued to pile up, and former homeowners who had been scammed started coming forward. A class action lawsuit was filed, and the court seized the HOA's remaining funds. The few board members who hadn't already resigned were forced to step down under the weight of legal and financial pressure. Then came the final nail in the coffin. A month after our courtroom victory, the Homeowners Association was officially dissolved. No more ridiculous fines. No more corrupt board members. No more HOA tyranny. The neighborhood threw a massive block party to celebrate, complete with fireworks and a ceremonial bonfire of old HOA violation notices. Someone even printed a giant "Good Riddance HOA" banner and draped it across the former HOA office building. But the best part? The residents banded together and bought the HOA's former office space. Then they turned it into a community center. The very building where Gerald had ruined people's lives was now being used for charity events, barbecues, and free legal workshops to help people fight back against predatory HOAs. Talk about poetic justice. Of course, Emily and I weren't done having a little fun at Gerald's expense. Since we now owned his former house, we decided to make a few changes. First, we rewrote the old HOA rules against him. We banned anyone named Gerald Whitman from entering the property. We permanently revoked his right to ever rejoin the community. And best of all, we installed a massive, flashing neon sign in the front yard that read, "Former home of the worst HOA president in history." Pictures of the sign went viral online. HOA-hating groups, legal experts, and even news stations shared it, making Gerald a national laughingstock. He tried to sue us for defamation. It was dismissed in less than 5 minutes. With his reputation in tatters and his bank account drained, Gerald struggled to find work. He went from running an HOA like a tyrant to taking a job as a parking lot attendant. It was almost too perfect. One day, Emily and I decided to pay him a visit. We pulled up to the parking lot where he worked, rolling down the window as he approached the booth. He recognized us instantly, his face twisting in rage. I grinned. "Hey, Gerald. Just checking to make sure you're following all the parking lot rules." Emily leaned over. Because, rules are rules. His eye twitched. He turned without a word and stormed off, leaving us laughing hysterically as we drove away. With the HOA gone, life in the neighborhood flourished. Property values went up without the HOA's interference. Families could paint their houses whatever color they wanted without getting fined. The new community center helped hundreds of people fight back against shady HOA practices. And best of all, Emily finally got to live in peace. She rebuilt her garden, turning it into a stunning display of flowers and greenery, something the HOA would have never allowed. One evening, as we sat on Gerald's old porch, she turned to me with a smirk. She said, "I never thought I'd say this, but buying Gerald's house might be the best decision we ever made." I laughed. Who knew the ultimate revenge was real estate investing? We clinked our glasses together, watching the sunset over our new, HOA-free neighborhood. Gerald had tried to steal from us. And in the end, we stole everything from him. Final score. Emily, 100. HOA, 0. Gerald, somewhere crying in a parking lot booth. Moral of the story? Never underestimate a homeowner who knows their rights. HOAs can try to cheat you, but sometimes they mess with the wrong people. And most importantly, if you ever get the chance to buy your enemy's house, take it. If you've ever had a nightmare experience with an HOA, share your story in the comments. And if you loved seeing Gerald get what he deserved, smash that like button and subscribe for more insane HOA takedowns. The dust had settled. The HOA was gone, Gerald was reduced to a parking lot attendant, and Emily was finally free to enjoy her home without fear of ridiculous fines or fraudulent foreclosures. But this wasn't just our victory. It was a wake-up call for homeowners everywhere. And if you're watching this, chances are you've either dealt with an HOA nightmare or know someone who has. So now let's talk about why this story matters, and how you can fight back against corrupt HOAs. This isn't just an isolated case. Stories like Emily's happen all the time. HOAs abuse their power by slapping homeowners with ridiculous fines for things like leaving their trash cans out 5 minutes too long. They use intimidation tactics to force people into compliance, threatening legal action over nonsense violations. And worst of all, some HOAs, like Gerald's, go as far as stealing homes through fraudulent foreclosures. And here's the scariest part. Most people don't fight back. Why? Because HOAs count on homeowners being too scared, too exhausted, or too unaware of their rights to push back. But as you just saw, they're not invincible. HOAs make mistakes. They overreach. And when they do, you can take them down. If you're dealing with an HOA from hell, here's what you need to do right now. Know your rights. Most HOA contracts have loopholes they don't want you to notice. Read them carefully and see if they're breaking their own rules. Document everything. Every letter, every email, every fine, keep copies of everything. HOA boards love to lie. Your paper trail is your best weapon. Public pressure works. When we exposed Gerald and his HOA's fraud, they collapsed under the pressure. Social media, news stations, even community meetings make noise. HOAs thrive on secrecy, so drag them into the light. Lawyers love cases like this. You'd be surprised how many lawyers are willing to take HOA fraud cases, especially if there's a pattern of abuse. Get the community on your side. If you're suffering, chances are your neighbors are too. Band together and fight back as a group. There's strength in numbers. And if your HOA refuses to listen, vote them out or dissolve the HOA entirely. You heard that right. Homeowners can overthrow an HOA board or vote to shut the whole thing down if enough people agree. That's exactly what happened in Emily's neighborhood. And now, no more power-hungry board members. No more insane fines. No more stolen homes. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever dealt with a nightmare HOA? Have they ever tried to fine you for something ridiculous? Or worse, do you know someone who had their house stolen like Emily? Drop your story in the comments below. Let's expose the worst HOAs out there and make sure no one else falls victim to their scams. And if you're lucky enough to live in an HOA-free neighborhood, comment HOA-free and loving it, so we can all celebrate together. Smash that like button. The HOA Hate Club needs you. If you loved seeing Gerald get what he deserved, do me a favor. Hit that like button, because every like is another punch in the face to corrupt HOAs everywhere. Subscribe for more insane HOA takedowns. Trust me, we're just getting started. Share this story with your friends and family, because the more people know their rights, the less power HOAs have. Remember, HOAs only win when we let them. Let's make sure they never get away with this again. Final words, a warning to corrupt HOAs. If you're an HOA board member watching this thinking, oh, that could never happen to us, I have one thing to say to you. We are watching. Try to scam one more homeowner, and you might just end up like Gerald. Homeless, broke, and working in a parking lot booth. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next HOA takedown. See you in the next one. Stay vigilant, stay informed, and never let an HOA push you around. HOA revenge is the best revenge.